This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders who are designing the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and Bradley Akubuiro has spent his career helping organizations navigate moments when everything is on the line. As a partner at Bully Pulpit International and former chief spokesperson for Boeing, he's advised some of the world's largest brands through high-pressure moments in sports, tech, fashion, and beyond. Now he's written a book called Faster, Messier, Tougher, which looks at how crisis communication has changed in an era shaped by populism, AI, and a deep decline in public trust. We're going to talk about what leaders get wrong when crisis hits, why the old comms playbook no longer works, and what organizations must do to survive when everything moves faster than the truth. Bradley, welcome to the show. How are you?
Joe, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And I want to share something with you, Bradley, because I dabbled in television for a little while, and I had this mentor and producer who I always used to butt heads with because he would always make decisions based on what the latest technology would say. Like we were doing a TV show during the height of Twitter when it was known as Twitter. And he would gauge the content based on what was on Twitter. And I said to him, you've been doing television for decades. Why are you relying so much on Twitter? And he said to me, he goes, Joe, you know what? I've been in this business a long time and I've run into a lot of dinosaurs, people that refuse to adapt to the times and they went extinct. I will never be a dinosaur. And the reason I bring up this anecdote is because early in the book, you argued that the old crisis communications playbook is dead. What are the biggest flaws in that old model? Let's give people context who are not the crisis experts as you have been working in this industry for years. Tell me what the old way of handling crisis, and then we're going to talk about the new way, which you lay out in the book.
Well, thanks for the question. I actually think it's really important to examine what works and what doesn't work, because there are some things that are still tried and true, and we shouldn't throw those out. What I would say is a couple of things. The world, and and if you don't mind, Joe, I'll kind of give you a little bit of what's changed. The world has become a much faster, much more polarized place. As we think about the technologies that have advanced, we have traditionally talked about kind of the 24/7 news cycle, how we are now moving at a much faster pace in terms of needing to feed the beast when it comes to questions that are coming from reporters, the things that are being reported on. We now have a world where anyone with a flip phone or a camera phone, I'm not using flip phones anymore, but anyone with a camera phone can actually record what's going on and tell their own story. And the platforms that have enhanced have allowed them to actually, in some cases, overtake more traditional forms of news gathering and information. And so people are able to get their sources from so many different places, which means you have to pay attention to the overall narrative, one that you're putting out, but also to these micro places that it may be actually put through a new filter that we're not used to. And so seeing that and knowing how to respond to that is huge. The additional piece of this is the polarization piece. Everyone that is getting their information is now having it fed to them through a different lens. This kind of goes back to what we were saying a minute ago in terms of anyone can tell a story, but also people can put a spin on the story that impacts who is listening to them and what they take away from it. And so we're losing more control than we ever have at a time when people are actually decreasing the amount of trust they put in institutions. And so we are now dealing with kind of multiple layers. And that's before you get into the malicious actors, those who actually want to unseat our narratives and to put things in context that's going to create fear or trouble for our brands.
It's funny, you talk about how a lot of stuff is tried and true. One that I think people in the crisis world still think is tried and true, but I completely disagree. I want to get your take on. It's the phrase, the Friday news dump. Because I am one growing up in the world where if there was bad news a company had, they would usually put it out Friday at 5 o'clock, knowing that most people, to people who don't know what this is, there used to be a thing called daily newspapers, and they used to go to bed at midnight and then come out the next morning. So if you dump that story on a Friday night, Saturday was the least read newspaper of the week. So that's what people would do. And it's funny, Bradley, you probably see this too. People are still trying it, but don't get that these media cycles are now 24/7. Tell me about that idea of the Friday news dump in a world where we have media surrounding us all day long.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, I get the feeling, you want to put something in and you're feeling, maybe people are going to go on and do their own thing. They're not going to have time to focus on my news, even if it comes out. But the reality is we're seeing a world where sometimes the Friday news dump works against you because there are so many intersections now between what you would consider to be news and culture. And if you are going to be a viral meme sensation, that might come from somebody actually seeing that and turning it into a meme or a GIF on a Friday night or Saturday morning. And so we actually have to think about this in a different way altogether. But, I still hold out hope. Maybe there's a place we can hide. I just haven't found it yet.
Hey, and you kind of implied earlier about the trust factor, and you painted the picture of where we're like, what makes trust harder to earn today than at any point in your career? I mean, you talked about the technology, the obviously the nefarious actors, but like the trust piece, I think that's the one thing that whether you're a public facing figure or whether you run a company, trust is so hard because the thing is, once you lose it, 9 out of 10 times it's gone. It's really hard to bring that back. So what makes trust harder today in 2026 as opposed to the as long as you've been doing it, Bradley?
Yeah, well, there are a handful of things. One is there are so many different disparate voices and perspectives that people actually don't know who to listen to. And so people have to figure out what are the things that reinforce my beliefs or my views of the world. And we are more likely to gravitate towards those things and distrust other things. And the challenge with that is that creates comfort, but not reliability, right? And so we've got to actually take that into consideration. Another piece of this, and something that's really important, is just the world feels more chaotic right now. We are seeing behaviors from leaders who have a different view of what this moment is than I think a lot of people who are sitting at home are thinking. That makes sense to me. And so that level of trust in our leaders is definitely waning, and institutions broadly. This was true if you think back to 2008 and the Great Recession that we saw at that time. People were saying we put a lot of faith in institutions that frankly let us down. And so people are looking across the spectrum, looking at COVID, looking at a lot of the things that are going on in the world and saying, do I trust the people who are in charge of making those decisions? And so when you are confronted with a lot of this, and again, against the backdrop of people who are trying in some cases to, disinform and to, warp our sense of reality, people are actually, they're not distrustful because we're inherently distrustful people. They're distrustful out of a sense of needing protection. And people are trying to protect themselves in this moment. And that's something I think once we understand, we can try to account for.
I know this is not your expertise, but like, thinking about, the way you've set the scenarios, and I bring this up all the time, Bradley, is that our brains were not built for this. Like evolution wise and biology wise, our brains were not used to have this much information pumped at us 24/7. And again, I grew up in the newspaper times and the three-channel universe. So it was a little more tolerable. But now the fact that we have so much information, is there I mean, we can't escape it. So what can we do to sort of bridge the gap of like humans can't humans can't take this all, but we still have a job to do. We still have trust to build. We have still have products to sell. What do you think about the biology piece in all this?
Yeah, it's very real. It's very real. And if you ignore it, it's at your own peril, right? So, what I would say is, from a brand perspective or from organizations that are trying to get their message across, what they need to think about is how do I actually not try to speak to everyone? When you try to speak to everyone, number one, many people will just flat out not hear you, right? To your point, Joe, there's so much noise in the environment that it's impossible to pay attention to everything going on, even if it's something that you care about. And so, if you are an organization, you need to think about how I can narrow the list of stakeholders that I am speaking to as thinly as possible. Be as targeted as you possibly can in that. Understand then, of the group that we are speaking to, this is oftentimes your, investors, and not just broad investors, but those who are invested in your business and your industry, those who are your employees, those who are your, actual community members in the places where you have your business that operates. How do we get as narrowly defined as possible when it comes to these stakeholder sets? And then with that, how do we get a better understanding of how they consume news, what they actually listen to, and what influences them? And also, what do they believe about us today? And are they the things we want them to believe about us? Because if we need to persuade them to think differently, that's going to take a certain type of very deliberate effort. And so once you have that kind of understanding and a path forward that takes those realities into account, you are able to then stop playing whack-a-mole with everything going on in the world and instead be very targeted about where you invest your limited energy and resources.
I want to double click on that targeting your audience and knowing your audience. We're recording this episode the day after the Oscars, and I'm not sure if you watched this the Oscars last night, Bradley. But at one point, Disney unveiled a new commercial for the Disney cruise line. And if you have not watched it, go to YouTube. Like, if you are a human being, you will be sobbing by the end of it, right? And so I thought it was really touching. And then I go on X and I see people post about it. And if you look at the comments, all the I would say half of them are snarky. Well, that's great if you can afford it, and because of the generational commercials talk about like going to Disney Cruise over generations, and I was thinking to myself, and I actually just wrote something about this before I got on the hopper with you, was that Disney knows not everybody can afford it. Like Disney knows that there are generations and generations of families that will not be able to afford Disney cruises no matter what. But and without them sounding cold about it, they don't care. They didn't make this commercial to connect with people who have generations of families that can't afford, so they know that. But obviously, the greater public doesn't know that, so they think it's snarky to make fun of. Oh, I think one of the jokes was like, "Great, you see what I spent your college tuition on was this Disney cruise." So they made it snarky about it. So, but that's why I wanted to highlight your point about like sometimes people don't know who they are talking to or should be talking to. How hard is that for you? Because again, at the end of the day, we're all humans and sort of are exposed to the same things in terms of technology, whether it's social media, television, what have you. How do you get people to target into like, hey, just because this party over here is talking about, it, don't worry about that. It's this party over here that you should really be zeroed in on.
Yeah, that's such a great question because it's one of the hardest things for us to do, particularly as those who work in communications. If you think about marketing, I think we often do it a lot better. You're going to target the 35 to 40-year-old who makes a certain income and lives in certain geographies and has an inclination to buy products that are in your category. And we're able to say that makes sense to us. Let's target to those people and meet them where they're at. When we're thinking about broader brand and corporate reputation, we very rarely apply that same lens and rigor to how we kind of pull together the audiences that we think we most need to move. And so I would actually argue, as companies are thinking about where to invest their time and energy, taking a marketing mindset and applying it to their overall brand corporate reputation is something that most organizations are less sophisticated on than they should be. And it's something we should be putting a lot more time into. And I think Disney is absolutely right in terms of how they've thought about making sure they're speaking to the audience that matters and tuning out the noise beyond it. Um, I will say, because it actually brings into color a really interesting point from the book. From the research that the book really leans on, there are five fault lines of modern reputational risk that you have to pay attention to. And they all kind of are essentially what you'd say are the dividing lines between one group and the other in this very polarized world we find ourselves in. It's not only the cultural and political thing that creates the polarization that we see, it is also an economic divide that we are seeing. And so when you have folks who are what you would consider to be the haves and then the have nots, it's as old as time. And when you put out something that creates a line between those two people, you will very often see kind of lightning strike, right? It becomes viral, it becomes something that creates conversation because it's us versus them. Disney's ad and many luxury brands actually find themselves stepping right on on that line. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, particularly if you know who you're trying to reach, but you should be prepared for what it may create. Um, the other places where you see them, additional in addition to the cultural political divide and the economic divide, are the tech divide, right? When you think about fears around AI, automation, there are the people who think that AI will be good for them and they're actually going to have a career that is augmented by these new technologies. And then there are the people who feel like they're going to be displaced by them. And so you're going to find yourself really struggling to tell a positive narrative about some of these technologies and the advancements if you haven't taken into consideration how your messaging is going to be perceived by those who feel like it's actually going to be harmful and not helpful to them. So you have the cultural political divide, the economic divide, the tech divide. There is the institutional trust divide, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And then also the information divide, which we talked about earlier too. Where are people getting their information? Are they getting it from the New York Times or are they getting it from TikTok? And again, that's not a knock. more than half of folks under the age of 40 are getting their information from TikTok, which means it is more bite-sized and it is more targeted to the things that they care about. And if you are missing these things, then you are actually going to realize that you're screaming in many cases into an empty room instead of reaching the people that you need to reach. And they're going to have perceptions about you and your organization that you didn't have an opportunity to influence.
That's great. Good stuff, Bradley. It's funny. I want to be honest with you, Brad. You are not the first crisis communication expert I've had on the podcast. So I don't want you to feel like I've cheated on you before. But and the reason I bring this up is because I love to ask this question of folks in your industry is that the idea of not all crises are created equal. And so I want to get your take on this because, and I'm sure you probably deal with this when dealing with clients and folks, is that every in your world you think everything's on fire. But then if you step outside, people are like, I don't even know that's happening. How do you relate to people you work with? And then obviously when people read this book and learn more about it, like the idea that, not everything is a five-alarm fire. Because I think we are so much into our world. And you see this a lot with like even celebrities and stuff where something breaks in the news and they'll think, oh my God, everybody's talking about this. And then if they step outside to like their like Starbucks, not a soul is going to bring it up or say anything to them because they're not in this 24/7 media world. So tell me about this idea of how do you weigh the heaviness of a crisis when how do you step out of it to realize how big it is?
Yeah. Well, look, if it is a crisis to the people you care about, it is a crisis, right? So what I mean by that is you may not always find yourself in a global, news moment in the crisis you're dealing with. But when you go back to what I was saying earlier around the stakeholders that you have to care a lot about, right? Those audiences that have the ability to impact your license to operate. If that group of people feels like their trust in you has been shaken by the event that's taken place, that is a crisis you need to pay attention to. And the flip side of that is if the internet has gone crazy over something and it actually doesn't matter to your core audiences that you care about, it isn't actually a crisis. And so developing a bit of a tiered system that helps you understand who is moved by the thing that's happened, what is the change in their impression of you or their behavior, which matters to you, that is impacted by the situation. And also, at the end of the day, like most of this stuff isn't going to be a massive issue that we're talking about, loss of life or other things. I was the chief spokesperson for Boeing after we had two planes that crashed in 2018 and 2019 that caused one of the largest corporate crises in contemporary history. 346 people lost their lives between those two incidents. And so when you think about a crisis, that is categorically in the crisis bucket. And it is, major global news when something like that happens. But day to day, most of the issues that we deal with, whether it is a cyber attack where, a handful of pieces of personally identifiable information have been lost of some of our customers, or it is a deep fake of our CEO that now has, caused confusion about what the brand cares about and what it plans to do next in its strategy. You always have to put it through the lens of who's impacted, who is going to care about this, and how does it either work with or work against the things that people expect from you and the reasons why they trust you.
If you don't mind, let's unpeel the layer of like the definition of crisis because, and for example, so recently the McDonald's CEO came under fire because on TikTok, you mentioned TikTok, ate the new hamburger and he was kind of awkward in the way he did that, and so he got roasted and became meme to death. Um, is that a crisis? Is like something like that? Would you consider that a crisis? And then you got to like put it out, or is that something you're like? The internet's undefeated. We can't win here. Do we ignore it? When it's something like that where it doesn't really affect the bottom line, but it's kind of embarrassing. How do you suggest people handle something like that?
Something like the McDonald's situation isn't inherently a crisis in and of itself. How you handle it can either make it a crisis or not, right? I think when you are looking at the brands who are smart about things like this, you recognize, to your point, John, I like how you put it, the internet is undefeated, right? And so you gotta lean into it. You gotta be able to laugh at yourself a little bit. One of the things that we see with consumers these days is they actually appreciate brands with a little bit more personality because it makes them feel more human. When we talk about institutional distrust, the flip side of that is people actually have higher levels of trust in individuals and humans than they ever have. And so the best thing you can do is make your brand seem human by being able to take that moment, laugh at yourself a little bit, and be able to kind of move the narrative along. And that's, I think, what McDonald's has done here and done it actually to great effect. And so other brands that have jumped into the fray have kind of made this a fun moment, and you don't lose anything from that. But if you take the opposite approach and you get stiff and defensive, you're going to find that pretty quickly there is a reason why the internet's not is undefeated.
I love it. Great. That's great. And I would love to get your takes from someone who's had to, toe this line of like the corporate side of things and then dealing with media. And I don't want to pile on to media because I think it's really hard. I mean, I'm an old school radio guy, so I get the dynamics of the way media works today, how it's more click driven it's more expensive to run media companies now, where you're not making much money through ads. But so I don't want to pile on, but I want to say this is that the media and the way a lot of like publications work is they're not reporting news, they're reporting on a social media post. So
Mhm.
someone will pull like like five tweets and be like, the internet is angry about blank, and then like put five posts, and then all of a sudden you've some writer has created a crisis that probably wasn't really there, but because they're looking for clicks and they're trying to drive engagement, they just pull five random things and they say this thing is now a thing. What's your take in terms of the current media landscape? I mean, you painted the picture earlier about how bleak it can be, but this idea of like being able to sort of enlarge in something that's really very tiny. How frustrating is that from the corporate side?
Yeah, this is interesting because I don't typically advise folks to get too deep into the is it fair, is it not fair of it all. I really say this is our reality. So, how do we need to shift to deal with it? I will say many folks are frustrated with that particular element, but also this is our reality. And as we are looking at the consumers that we're trying to reach, many of them are much more online than they've ever been before. When you actually look and your phone will tell you how many hours you've spent online, it puts it right in your face. It is almost always unsettling. And the reality is nowadays, people not only pay attention to, what they're seeing in their, threads and their Truth Social and their Blue Sky and their X, all of the in their TikToks, all of these formats, but they also do pay attention to what are the trends, what are the signals they're getting from others, what should they go hop on and take a look at. And so if you didn't see it from reporters, you would see it just by what's curated for you in your feed. You would hear about it by what's sent to you by your friends. One thing that I think is a benefit of the media doing that aggregation is you at least have something pointed to that you can still actually monitor. And then you're able to kind of see where do I need to be paying attention. And so, is it good? Is it bad? I don't know, but it is reality.
Yeah. So you've been doing this for a while. When you first entered crisis communications and corporate communications, what surprised you the most about how companies handled a crisis? Was there something early on where you were like, as a young kid, because as we're younger, we know everything. Was there something early on where you were like, why are they doing it like that?
I don't know that there's a specific thing. What I would say is I got involved with crisis not on the communication side in the first place, but on the policy side. I was working in Liberia. I was working for the then president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, also a Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner. And one of the reasons that she won that is because she was trying to rebuild a democracy in post Civil War Liberia. And one of the really fascinating things about that was you had folks who were actually, 14, 15 years old who were asked to pick up guns and attack their neighbors. And then they were asked after the war to just go back to school and to grade school and sit next to some of the same people who they were shooting at and being shot at by. And you just have to accept that we're gonna put that behind us and move forward. And so when I think about this kind of process, the thing that I think most people often don't spend enough time thinking about is the aftermath of a crisis, right? So how you deal with a crisis, how you actually stem the bleeding and actually contain the problem. I think the fundamentals of that have remained the same, but the time that actually goes into what does it look like to truly rebuild trust over time? What does it really look like to make people feel some level of affinity and connection to what we are trying to collectively do over time, to buy people back into a collective vision, to really kind of say, I know what we went through together was really hard, but what we're trying to achieve is actually going to be better than what we were left with before we began this. Those are hard things to do, but I think that those are the responsibilities of leadership and of leaders. And so when I think about communications and crisis communications, I think of an opportunity, right? And the opportunity is to bring people along with you on that journey in a way that they are much more ready to do once they've seen what the alternative is.
Let's stick with the aftermath of a crisis because you write that crisis doesn't build culture, it reveals it. And so we've been talking mostly about the consumer facing crisis, like what happens to like you the consumer's connection to you, the trust piece we've been talking about. But let's talk about the crisis and the aftermath internally at companies. What does that look like? Because I think selfishly we're always like, oh, okay, the crisis is just going to affect the bottom dollar. Maybe their Q4s are going to go down. Things are going to be affected next year. But like, what happens inside the building after that crisis?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that I think actually organizations should pay the most attention to, right? I've worked at companies where employees who are working on the shop floor and other places have been around for 20, 30, 40 years. They might be a second or third generation person. Some of these guys on the shop floor, particularly in some of the aerospace companies I've worked at, have the logo tattooed on their arms. I mean, these are people whose identities are tied up in the organization because they believe in it so much and it is so intrinsic to how they view themselves. And so, what I would say is if you ignore the psychological impacts of a crisis on folks who actually see themselves tied up in the company, you are ignoring the reality that people's views of themselves are shattered in these moments in many cases, particularly if they don't necessarily agree with how the organization has responded to it. And so, what you have to be thinking about almost more than anything is if my employees are a key stakeholder, and they always are, and in many cases are your number one stakeholder, how are they perceiving the actions that you're taking to resolve this matter and ensure that it can never happen again? And also, when you are telling a story about the things you're doing to fix the problem, are they things that if your employee was asked about them by their family or their friends, that they would agree and say, "Yeah, that's what's happening, and we're moving forward, and we trust this process." Because your employees can either be your greatest ambassadors or your most credible detractors. And so if you are not bringing them along with you and they don't feel like they actually are represented and their experiences aren't represented in the story you're telling, they are very, 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 very quickly going to tear that apart, and that's gonna be more damaging than anything.
That's interesting. Like I said, I've cheated on you. I've spoken to other crisis, but I've never heard that part, like the culture piece of crisis. And you mentioned that's something that people are. Do people take it for granted in your experience that like let's put out all these other fires and then hopefully the one inside the house is going to be okay. Is that sometimes hard for you to remind folks that like, hey, listen, the crisis is not just outside your building; outside, it's inside as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the things that organizations most commonly slip on, right? What happens? We see the news story. We hear the talking heads talking about it externally. We get the calls from our investors that are now panicked because they're seeing what's happening with the stock and they want to know if they should stay in it or not. The board of directors says, we need to address this, immediately. And you're hearing all of these inputs. And so you're like, okay, we need to put those fires out. But who are the people who are actually usually the least likely to raise their hand and say something about it? It's your employees. These are the folks who actually very silently become disappointed and they have a tendency to kind of withdraw, and you don't know why it's happening and you often don't notice it until it's too late. And so, what you have to do is take a very early and a very consistent approach to taking a pulse on how they feel, where they're at, because not only are they the ones who have the most ability to harm you if they're talking externally about whether they feel like the company's got the right leadership in the right moment or not, but also you need them in order to accomplish your objectives. If the employees are not bought in and plugged in, then every goal that you have, particularly in these big, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousand, person organizations, it's not the CEOs turning the wrench. If you don't have the group, the workforce who is committed to the path forward, it ain't gonna happen.
Mm. Good stuff. Great, Bradley. I want to get a couple things before we wrap up our time here. You talk about the authenticity paradox, especially for minority leaders in corporate environments. What makes authenticity harder today than it was a decade ago? And tell me more about this authenticity paradox.
Yeah, I don't know that authenticity is necessarily in itself harder than it was a decade ago, but I think there's a greater expectation that people will be authentic in their leadership. And because of that, and we are all now kind of, we see the literature all the time. Great leaders are the ones who are most authentic, bring your full self to work, all of those things. But the reality is, what's talked about less is the catch 22 of authenticity, particularly for minority leaders, not only for minority leaders, but particularly for minority leaders. What happens when bringing your full self to work actually highlights the difference between you and the other people you work with? That difference, just by human nature, actually creates discomfort instead of comfort. Because why do we encourage people to be authentic? It's because when people can see themselves in you, it makes them trust you more, and it makes them more likely to forgive whatever mistakes you might make because they see you as a person. When they now see you as other, that actually causes the opposite effect. It causes people to say, I don't feel like I truly understand that person, where they're coming from, and how they think and why they think it. And as a result, I'm going to question their actions. And so, what you have to do as a minority in so many cases, or what you're asked to do in this climate, is be yourself, but not so much of yourself that you make people uncomfortable, right? Uh, make decisions, but make decisions that are in line with the expectations around you and not necessarily the things that are your own lived experience, right? And I think as we have seen the outward assault on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, we are also seeing a lot of folks who are asking themselves, when I am feeling this way, when I am feeling attacked, I'm feeling, in many cases, persecuted by the conversations that are going on. How much license do I even have to express that? Or will I be further persecuted for having taken a stand or made a suggestion? And those are the things that I think you're constantly grappling with. And they're things that I think organizationally we need to take account for and figure out, how do we make our organizations a place that everyone can feel comfortable and everyone can feel cared for.
Awesome. All right, one more thing. Outside of reading the book, if you had to give one piece of advice to the next generation of communicators stepping into what you call the faster, messier, tougher environment, what would it be?
Well, first of all, read the book. I know that's not, I know I can't make that the right answer. So the right answer, I think, is don't be afraid to fail, right? The whole concept around this faster, messier, tougher concept is that we actually have to be ready for things to not have clean solutions. There's no such thing as a clean win in communications anymore in this perma-crisis environment. And so the way you have to think about this is, what are the things that I'm going to try and learn from quickly? What are the things that I might not have a perfect answer for when asked, but I have a partial answer for? And let me tell people what I know and what I don't know, and when I might be able to get back to them with the things that I don't know, right? How do I figure out how to bring people together on issues that aren't necessarily cleanly things that we're all aligned on, but things that we can find points of alignment on? And let's try to take that and build from there. If you are not careful to account for this, you're going to find yourself very, very quickly on the wrong side of a lot of these crises and not in a position to recover quickly.
Awesome. Here's Bradley Akubuiro. The book, Faster, Messier, Tougher, Crisis Communication Strategies in an Era of Populism, AI, and Distrust. Bradley, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Joe, thank you. Really appreciate you.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Bradley and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.